Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Duncan Wood. Duncan is the Wilson Center's Vice President for Strategy and New Initiatives. Duncan is also the driving force behind the Wilson Center initiative, exploring supply chains and critical minerals. He joins us today for an update on those topics. Duncan, welcome back. Great to see you.
Thanks, John. It's great to be back with you.
So, I was thinking about this and anticipating our discussion, and before the pandemic, the reality is the majority of us didn't think about supply chains. It's something we took for granted. We showed up at the supermarket wherever we were shopping, things were on the shelves, and we didn't really think about those invisible hands behind that movement of products globally. Now we all think about it, right? From the early days of looking for antiseptic wipes or toilet paper or whatever it might be. We've spoken before, and I wonder, as the world is moving into a recovery stage from the pandemic and an attempt to define a new normal, are supply chains recovering as well?
I think the answer to that obviously is quite complex, but I think we're seeing an evolution in the approach to supply chains. First stage is exactly what you've outlined. We've become aware of supply chains, whereas before there was just this assumption that goods somehow miraculously showed up at the store or at our front door if you ordered them online. And now we're a lot more aware that there are many, many intricate steps along the way, and these are complex and dynamic systems in which, if something goes wrong, a labor dispute at a port or a logistical problem on a canal or on a highway, then all of a sudden the goods don't make it through. I think we're also seeing that policy is moving forward on supply chains. I think the last time that we spoke, we'd had a 100-day review by the Biden administration of supply chains. We've now had a 1-year review, and we've seen the beginning of an approach of using legislation to try to address supply chain issues, as well as executive actions such as the use of the Defense Procurement Act to try to address some of the immediate shortfalls. We've seen a development as well in the way that the private sector is approaching supply chains. We're seeing how they are taking this a lot more seriously. Interestingly, we're seeing a huge recruitment drive for supply chains and logistics managers, but we're also seeing the corporate strategy evolving. Companies making sure they know exactly where not just every product, but every component of every product comes from, so that you not only know exactly where problems might emerge, but you put in place a backup plan in case there is an interruption. We've also seen an amazing level of investment that's taken place here in the United States on critical minerals, but also on semiconductors. The announcement of major new investments by companies like Intel in Ohio, developing the US capacity to produce semiconductors, hopefully reducing the dependence of the United States overseas. And of course, lastly, and the big one, is the conflict in Ukraine, which has shown us how the direct implications of the conflict, certain critical minerals, obviously food supplies being interrupted, but also the indirect implications and consequences of the sanctions that have been applied, all of a sudden forcing companies and countries to reassess their supply chains and to find alternative sources.
To the degree that it's possible to generalize, did the pandemic create the problems, or did it also expose weaknesses that were already in place?
I think it's very much the latter, to be honest with you, John. In retrospect, and it's, hindsight is 2020, of course, but, in retrospect, a lot of these processes were underway anyway. And, we're now at a point where for many countries, governments, companies, and populations have learned to live with COVID. It's a different case in countries like China, of course. But, the supply chain issues continue to be there. So it clearly wasn't just COVID. We had come to depend upon an entirely globalized world and a system of manufacturing which was so heavily, profoundly integrated across borders that we had just come to assume that that would always be the case. With COVID, we saw how problems that it can emerge on the public health level, but then afterwards in terms of logistical issues, political issues, how that can cause massive disruptions by interrupting those supply chains. And so, one of the ways that I like to look at this is actually in the evolution of the supply chain paradigm that we've seen over the past couple of years. A few years ago, we were very much in a paradigm of lowest cost, just in time, efficiency as much as anything. So that was one based upon value. And now we're very much in a paradigm for supply chains, which is about values. In other words, yes, we want to make sure that we're buying from the right people. We want to make sure we're not engaging in illegal labor practices anywhere along the supply chain. We want to make sure that we're respecting environmental standards, corporate governance, corruption, transparency, etc. So all of those environmental, social governance, ESG factors that are there. And of course, very much so now, we're focused on questions of security of supply, in other words, avoiding disruptions, but also national security concerns and geopolitics. So as I say, we've moved from a focus on value to one on values and national security. And this obviously calls to mind the importance of geopolitics in today's calculation. In retrospect, a lot of that was already underway. The broader tendencies that we'd seen at play in the international system, potential decoupling between China and the United States, the rising tensions with certain governments around the world, increasing concern about authoritarian regimes. All of this was really brought together during COVID and now Ukraine. And so what we're seeing is actually an acceleration of processes that were already there.
Does this indicate, Duncan, that consumers, if they want to have a more reliable, more just, less exploitive system globally, will have to pay a little more? Is this something where you get what you pay for?
I think we're very much in that. Even before the current concern over inflation, a lot of the conversations that we had in our stakeholder dialogues last year focused on the need to understand the supply chain, not just in terms of dollars and cents, but in terms of what you get in as part of that supply chain. Are we respecting labor rights? Are we respecting environmental standards? Are we fighting corruption, enforcing transparency, et cetera, et cetera? All of that has to be taken into consideration when you're calculating the price of the good. So that if it's something that's produced here in the United States, where we have relatively high standards on all of these issues, then maybe we should be willing to pay a little bit more than if we're sourcing it from a country where those same standards are not respected, or from a country which is a geopolitical rival of the United States. And that's where I think we are right now. Now, of course, living as we do in an era of high inflation at the moment, that's a lot more difficult to swallow in the sense that, if we move to that paradigm, are we going to see prices go up even more? However, I would say that in the long term, that's very much the direction that we're moving in. And I think that it's inevitable that we are going to have to sacrifice some of that emphasis, almost obsession on cutting prices in order to have a more reliable and resilient supply chain.
About resilience, how is this evolution that's occurring addressing resilience? I think of things like the hubs in airlines, and the way that airlines are organized around hubs. So if there's bad weather in Chicago or in Atlanta, these major airports, the effects can ripple around the world. Or a cargo ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal. How vulnerable or resilient is the supply chain scenario globally in that regard?
I think we've seen recently how vulnerable it is, how exposed it is to risk. In some ways, it's a very fragile supply chain. As long as everything is moving along nicely, as long as there's no major wars internationally or any major breakdowns of government or border issues, things move fine. But once the problems begin to emerge, it can set off this kind of domino effect throughout the system. And this is why part of the new paradigm for supply chains is really focused on questions of reshoring, bringing as much of the production process back here to the United States, nearshoring in our immediate neighbors, Canada, Mexico, the Americas, and of course, ally or friend shoring, using our allies in Europe, in Asia, to be part of a supply chain where we can actually put a lot more trust in place on that. And I think that a lot of the Biden administration's recent moves, including the beginnings of negotiations for an Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, are really focused on that. It's about building economic blocks where we can depend upon each other, where we're not exposed to the same level of risk.
When things happen, which they inevitably do, whether it's something like human error or weather events, or in the horrific case of Ukraine, an invasion, a hostile invasion, or the unexpected, predictably unexpected, like a pandemic, how long does it take from the event to us to start to understand what's happening and to actually see those empty shelves or other manifestations of the breakdown of the supply chain?
It very much depends upon the product that we're talking about. If it's a product which is quite far down the value chain or the supply chain, let's say the raw material itself, there may be enough of that in the system already, and enough of the final finished goods that are being produced or already produced and in warehouses that we don't feel it for months. However, given the flow of information and data in the global economy right now, the inflationary impact of that can take effect very, very quickly. It's not that there's a shortage, it's just that people are anticipating problems down the road. And of course, that can apply to almost every component of the supply chain, from the raw materials, the energy, even, of course, the human capital that we need to make these things happen.
Where are the hotspots right now? What are the areas of concern, whether they be on the human level, employees, or on the product level or the natural resource level? Where are the hotspots, the things that are of most concern currently?
I mean, let me point to two. I think that we still have major concerns on the critical minerals front. We're dashing headlong towards electrification of the vehicle fleet here in the United States. Studies that we've analyzed here at the Wilson Center and included in our publications show that if we reach the target of 50% of all vehicles being sold by 2030 are electric vehicles, then we simply don't have enough critical minerals to make the batteries that we need for those vehicles. So, we desperately need to increase production, increase the processing and refining of critical minerals to allow that to happen. And I think you could see that on a number of issues. Perhaps the most headline worthy of those right now is, of course, food. The crisis that we're seeing unfolding in Ukraine, and the halting of grain exports from Ukraine means that we are going to see a food crisis develop on a really disastrous scale in many parts of the world. That feeds into inflation here in the United States and Europe, etc. But for many developing countries, that is very much a matter of life or death. The second kind of vulnerability and crisis that I'm seeing unfolding is more of a longer term one. And that's, of course, to do with Chinese potential aggression towards Taiwan. And it's been widely reported and commented on, of course, for many years. But given the central place that Taiwan plays in the global semiconductor supply chain, an interruption of production of semiconductors from the Taiwanese economy would be absolutely disastrous, not just for computers and other electronics, but of course for the electric vehicles and other vehicles that we use today. We're seeing that the highest end vehicles that have intelligent cruise control or even self-driving, I mean, they have tens of thousands of semiconductors in them. And if that supply was to be interrupted because of a growing or deepening crisis between China and Taiwan, then the world economy would be in a really, really difficult place.
I was at a supermarket last week, and I can't even remember what the product was that wasn't there. I know that there's been a lot of focus recently on baby formula. But, I overheard anecdotally one customer say to another, I guess it's a supply chain problem. So suddenly this is in common usage. People are thinking and talking about this. How do we unpack that when we encounter some sort of a shortage? Should we automatically assume supply chain? It's so complex. Where do you begin to understand it from that in the trenches level?
So I think that the fact that people are aware of it is actually a step in the right direction, because it means that we have really incorporated the fact that goods don't just magically materialize out of nowhere into our way of thinking. That means that we're probably more politically sensitive to it. We're probably a few steps along the way to accepting that, price is just one of the elements that we need to take into consideration. In terms of working out where the problem is, I think that we, at the level of the average voter, we haven't moved very far. But that's why the point that I mentioned earlier on, this massive recruitment drive for supply chain and logistics managers is so important. Companies themselves are spending a lot more time, money, and effort on this, understanding how their supply chains are configured, preparing for potential interruptions, disruptions in the future, and thinking, sort of outside of the box. Would we be able to live without China? Would we be able to live not just without the market, but actually their production facilities, all those components that we get over here? And if we do need to think about that, then how do we go about building in resilience and redundancies into the supply chain that will allow that to happen?
Final thought, Duncan, on the public-private partnership angle. You've mentioned that the investments that are taking place and the renewed focus in energy in the private sector. Is the government keeping pace? Is there a role for them as well?
So a lot of the US government approach so far has been really focused on the national security angle, which is very, very important. I think that not enough work has been done to bridge the gap between the corporate perspective, the broader sort of economic perspective, and that national security perspective. But I think we're beginning to get there. What I think is really missing right now is that we've had a 100-day review, we've had a 1-year review, we're seeing different actions being taken by the executive, legislative action in Congress. We still don't have a viable strategy, or at least there isn't one out there that is recognizable. And I think that's what it's going to take for us to be able to pull together all of these different parts so that finally we'll be able to say, we know that this is a major issue, and we know that we're going to need all of these different pieces to come together, from the financing, human capital, logistics, infrastructure, collaboration with our foreign allies. That's what it's going to take to make sure that the United States isn't in a vulnerable situation in the future, as it has been over the past couple of years.
Well, Duncan, you're doing terrific work in contributing to the goal of coming up with that grand strategy. So thank you not only for your work, but for coming and sharing the latest with us.
Thanks, John. It's always a pleasure.
Our guest is Duncan Wood. For more on Duncan and all of his work, you could come to wilsoncenter.org. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.